I hate hearing people say censorship doesn't happen in the gaming industry. Stop blowing everything out of proportion because those same people clearly don't follow censorship news. Now, I talk about censorship all of the time here on the channel, whether it's in North America or Europe, Japan, China, Australia, whether it's manga or anime or video games, entertainment, and censorship in the gaming industry specifically is very real no matter how much people want to deny it. Now, Resident Evil Village has been a highly anticipated game. I mean, everyone is ready to see where this story's going to take us, and let's be honest, everybody's ready to meet Lady Dimitrescu, but I love the Resident Evil series, so I've really been looking forward to it. I'm excited to see what's going to happen in this story, but unfortunately, if you're a Japanese gamer, there's a bit of bad censorship news when it comes to Resident Evil Village. So this is a HeyPoorPlayer.com article. Resident Evil Village will feature no decapitations, less blood, and fewer controversial scenes when it arrives in Japan to comply with Zero standards. So when it comes to Resident Evil, doing things like blowing zombies' head off with a well-placed shotgun blast is second nature. However, players who decide to pick up the Japanese version of Resident Evil Village won't be able to enjoy the simple pleasure that comes from popping up the undead's noggins like overly ripe cantaloupes. I'm sure that all of you guys know, if you've seen Resident Evil, even just trailers, Resident Evil does have a lot of that type of content: blood, guts, gore, zombies, lots of violence, lots of death, sometimes also sexual references. So that's not surprising when it comes to the Resident Evil games. But it says, while the developers say basically there is no difference in the game's content from the overseas version, Capcom has confirmed in a statement that Resident Evil Village will be censored when it releases in Japan to comply with the country's Computer Entertainment Rating Organization, or the Zero standards, which has very strict rules against the dismemberment of humanoid characters in video games. And for starters, it will not feature any decapitations, and additionally, the game will also include less blood than in the North American and European versions. Now, in some regions, this isn't very surprising. Like, let's look at China, for instance. They are extremely strict with what content gets into games and what content they ban. They do not allow blood of any kind anymore, corpses, skeletons. They don't allow a lot of violence. They are very strict when it comes to content. But Japan actually wasn't that way in the past. Zero has definitely gotten very strict on ratings. A game that might have gotten a 0D in the past now gets a 0Z. It's basically the equivalent in the United States to the movie ratings, where we have NC-17 and rated R. So I wanted to show you all the ratings board really quickly so you can understand the difference between D and Z a little bit better. So 0D is for 17-year-olds and above, expression and content suitable. Only to 17-year-olds and above are included in the game. And 0Z says for 18-year-olds and above, only expression and content suitable. Only to 18-year-olds and above are included in the game, and this assumes that the game should not be sold or distributed to those younger than 18 or older. So let's head back to the article. Capcom noted in the message detailing the changes that the 0D version, which is intended for players 17 and older, will contain less graphic depictions of violence than the adults-only 0Z rated build. However, the lack of beheadings will apply to both the 0Z and D editions of Resident Evil Village. Additionally, both versions will feature less blood than the Western release, and it says in addition to the toned-down gore, the Japanese version will also lack certain scenes prohibited by Zero. However, those scenes were not detailed, most likely to avoid any potential spoilers retaining to the game's story. So when it comes to Village, they're actually planning to release two different versions of the game, which is an interesting concept because you've got a version with less blood, guts, and gore and sexual themes, more aimed towards a younger audience, and then you've got the version for adults with all of that content all in its glory. So I definitely do see the point in doing that, and they also did do that for Resident Evil 7, But they're censoring both versions of the game anyway. It's not like one is toned down and one's untouched, which sucks if you're someone who's playing these versions of the game. Now, in the United States, we do have the mature and adult only ratings, but to get the adult only rating, it's basically reserved for pornographic content in games. And of course, we don't have any laws that say that there's an age where you can and can't see certain violence. That is decided by the independent ratings boards like the MPAA and the ESRB in games, but games with pornographic content are dictated by law, which is where the adult-only rating comes in. But the whole reason to make the Zero D version is so that you can leave all of the blood and gore and sexual themes in the Zero Z one, yet they also have a version to sell to a younger audience or people who don't want that content. And I am not in any way going after them for making two different versions, but they're defeating their own purpose by censoring anything in the Zero Z version. It is ridiculous that there's two different versions, yet they're both censored. Now, Resident Evil has had a pretty long history of censorship in Japan. Specifically, almost every Resident Evil game has been censored in some way, shape, or form, but Zero's been pretty heavy-handed when it comes to ratings lately. They've been handing out a lot of high ratings for games, and I wanted to go over a little bit about Resident Evil 7 censorship because the North American version, of course, and the Japanese version were very different content-wise. So it says, see how Resident Evil 7 was censored for its Japanese release. Now, when it comes to Resident Evil 7, the general consensus seems to be that Capcom has successfully returned the series to its horror roots, which it accomplished in a number of ways. A lot of people really loved Resident Evil 7. I thought it was a pretty good game, which is why a lot of people are kind of excited for Resident Evil Village. But it says one way that Capcom builds the game's horror atmosphere is through the use of horrific violence and gore, but some fans may be interested in knowing that Resident Evil 7's Japanese release was toned down quite a bit when compared to its release elsewhere. Read on to learn some ways that it was censored. So, it says showing decapitations or decapitated heads is taboo in Japanese media, so it's understandable that one scene in Resident Evil 7 with a cop's severed head has been altered for the Japanese release. When players are being tormented by Lucas Baker, the devilish family member behind the twisted birthday cake puzzle, he leaves the mutilated head of a cop in the refrigerator with a note that tells players where to go to find the snake key. In the Japanese release, though, players simply find a photograph of the cop with his face crossed out instead of his head. Pretty pathetic in my opinion, but then again, I think that all censorship is pretty pathetic. I do not support censorship at all. But it says when players go to find the snake key in the dissection room, where they find it is different depending on if they're playing in the United States version or the Japanese release. In the US version, poor Ethan Winters has to stick his hand through the neck of the dead police officer. This was such a creepy moment in the game. I freaked out when I saw this for the first time. It is just so gory and so violent and just so creepy having to watch someone do this, but I mean, I guess it's just a video game, so it doesn't really matter. But in the Japanese version, the snake key is simply lying on the stretcher next to the cop's intact but still mutilated head. So they do end up censoring very strategically in a way, because the body's still there in the Japanese version. It's still mutilated. His head is still kind of bashed in, but it is very strategically censored. Yet another case of censorship involving the cop happens to be at the time of his death, right before the garage boss fight with Baker family patriarch Jack Baker. While the cop is busy talking to Ethan, Jack sneaks up behind him, cutting his head in half with a shovel. This game is brutal, but then again, every Resident Evil game has its brutal moments, and in the US release, the top of the cop's head slips off when Jack does this, but his head remains in one piece in the Japanese version. The final case of censorship in Resident Evil 7's Japanese release doesn't have to deal with the ill-fated police officer, but it still features a severed limb early on in the game, so as you can see, there was quite a bit of censorship in the Resident Evil 7 Japanese release for the game, and of course there were two different versions, the Zero D and the Zero Z version, just like what what is happening with Resident Evil Village, but it ends off with describing what Village is about. It says, set a few years after the horrifying events in the critically acclaimed Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, the all-new storyline begins with Ethan Winters and his wife Mia living peacefully in a new location, free from their past nightmares, or so they thought. Just as they are building their new life together, tragedy befalls them once again. It is a first-person action game. Players will assume the role of Ethan Winters and experience every up-close battle and terrifying pursuit through a first-person perspective. Unfortunately, this isn't something new. Again, Zero's gotten pretty heavy-handed when it comes to giving out ratings, and I'm glad that this game is releasing at all in Japan, since they could have just outright banned it instead of offered Capcom, the chance to make two different versions, but it's still censorship, and it really sucks to see happen, and all we can do is hope that nothing at all whatsoever will be censored in the North American and European versions of the game, so we can all enjoy the vision the creators had for it. But let everyone know your thoughts in the comments section down below. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. And of course, if you did not, make sure to give it a dislike. I appreciate your support either way, but I will talk to you all again in the next video really soon.